Of a vital but aging bridge in the Pacific Northwest is raising some big questions about just how safe other bridges and structures are in this day and age.
The Riverside Bridge over I-5.
Vehicles plunged into the water, beams collapsed, and 3 people were injured last week when this bridge over Washington State's Skagit River suddenly gave way.
You can see that the concrete section of that dropped span has slid off of its girders like icing sliding off of a cake.
The collapse of a 160-foot chunk of the bridge made for spectacular pictures that refocused the nation's attention on the state of its transportation infrastructure. The National Transportation Safety Board, chaired by Debbie Hersman, is investigating the failure, which occurred after a portion of the span was hit by a truck.
At the end of the day, why we are here is to figure out what happened, why it happened, and to issue recommendations to prevent it from happening again.
The government's National Bridge Inventory had rated the Skagit River Bridge as functionally obsolete, outdated but not necessarily unsafe. Hundreds of similar bridges dot the national landscape. In 2007, the Interstate 35 bridge that carried traffic over the Mississippi River between Minneapolis and St. Paul also collapsed suddenly, killing 13 people and injuring 145. It had been classified structurally deficient. By last year, nearly a quarter of the nation's 607,000 bridges were classified as structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. The Federal Highway Administration reports that figure has actually dropped by more than 16,000 since 2005. But the Obama administration has repeatedly pressed Congress to increase spending on bridges and roads.
Hello, Miami!
In March, the president visited the Port of Miami.
We've still got too many roads that are in disrepair, too many bridges that aren't safe. We don't have to accept that for America. We can do better. We can build better.
But Republicans, led by House Speaker John Boehner, have resisted spending more unless it's paid for.
It's easy to go out there and be Santa Claus and talk about all the things you want to give away, but at some point, somebody's got to pay the bill.
Federal officials estimate it would take about $20 billion a year to address all of the nation's bridge problems over each of 15 years. That's about $8 billion more than federal, state, and local governments spend now. We take up some of the questions raised by all this now with 2 people who watch this field. Casey Dinges is Senior Managing Director of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And Dan McNichol is Infrastructure Analyst and writer. He studied the collapse of the Minnesota Bridge and has been writing the history of the newly rebuilt San Francisco Bay Bridge. Welcome to you both. How serious, Casey Dinges, are these deficiencies?
Well, looking at the broader infrastructure, ASC released a report card of the nation's infrastructure this year, gave an overall grade of a D+, which is a marginal improvement from the letter grade D that we issued in 2009. But as President Obama indicated at the Port of Miami recently, still not a great grade. There's a lot of work to be done. In the case of bridges, the grade actually went up since 2009. Your setup piece showed nicely there's been improvement, reduction in the number of structurally deficient bridges across the country. Nevertheless, we still have 65,000 structurally deficient bridges in this country and 85,000 functionally obsolete bridges. So there's still work to be done.
Dan McNichol, maybe you could help us with these definitions here. We know about functionally, fracture critical is one, and then there's structurally deficient and functionally obsolete. What's the difference? It all sounds bad to me.
and it can be very bad. The functionally obsolete means if it were rebuilt today, they would not build it like they did when they first built it. It's just out of date. It's historically not up to snuff. Structurally deficient is a whole other category that tends to be more serious. If the bridge is in disrepair, if it's going to fall or collapse or anywhere near it, it's going to definitely have a structurally deficient category. And then lastly, if you think about fracture critical, any bridge that has a minimal design where if one piece fails, it all fails, that's fracture critical.
And that's what we saw happen in Washington State.
That's right.
If I could add one thing to what Dan said about fracture critical, it's not every piece on a fracture critical bridge. There are certain elements of that bridge that are critical, and if they fail, there's risk of a greater failure of the structure. So The bridge was fracture critical. It was also functionally obsolete early into this NTSB investigation. And I harken back to the Minneapolis Bridge in 2007. In the first few days and weeks after that collapse, we knew nothing about gusset plates. And yet that ended up being
Gusset plates.
Gusset plates are pieces of metal that help connect together different beams and girders on the bridge, and it was a design flaw in one of those gusset plates that bridge down. So,
in the early days, Dan McNichol, we heard the governor of the state of Washington say, "Hey, listen, if a truck hadn't hit this bridge, basically that's what caused this problem." So, when we look at these kinds of weaknesses, are we talking about accidents? Are we talking about maintenance that's been deferred, or are we just talking about age?
All the above. Most of the bridges in the United States have been neglected as far as maintenance goes. I'm a fan of the DOTs, and they do remarkable work in maintaining their structures with the resources they have. But every DOT would like to have more money to put at fixing these bridges. And when you look at a bridge like the I-5 bridge, sure, you can say it's older, you can say that a truck hit it and it shouldn't have, but it's part of the U.S. interstate system. And those red, white, and blue shielded highways are our king, are the top of the food chain when it comes to transportation and logistics. And if we've neglected in short time, in 7 years, we've seen 2 major bridge collapses that indicate that we have neglected our system as a whole. And when the chief system of transportation and supply chains has been neglected, there's great concern that the other lesser bridges have been neglected even more so.
Casey Dinges, let's talk about what we should be doing as a result. Can these structures be shored up, the ones we've identified, or should they just be replaced?
Engineers will make that call and advise their DOTs on that. Some cases just greater maintenance, in some cases rehabilitation, in some cases outright replacement. North of New York City, the Tappan Zee Bridge, a major structure, is being replaced. So sometimes you have to go all the way with that. The public needs to be engaged on this. Congress, over the next 12 months, will have to look at a reauthorization of the federal transportation programs. They have to look at funding issues. I mean, that's center stage right now. And the Highway Trust Fund, which is where user fees are collected in this country to pay for our federal programs, that trust fund will go bankrupt by the end of next year.
Dan McNichol, you pay attention to these issues when bridges are not collapsing, when the public attention is not necessarily focused on them. Do you detect that there is a will either in local government, federal government, or even among individuals to do what it takes? It's a very costly project.
That's right. Bridges are celebrated in this country. The Golden Gate Bridge, the Bay Bridge, the George Washington Bridge. We love our structures. We love our bridges. But there's been serious neglect, and there's been serious decay in political will. But I feel, Gwen, that we're now at a point where we're starting to see people become educated. Politicians don't lead. The public leads. And when they demand better bridges and better maintenance and a different culture in maintaining our vital structures, then we'll see change. And I believe we've begun to see that change, which is very exciting.
Is that change likely to come, Casey Dinges, from maybe the private sector more than the public sector at this point?
There's a lot of discussion about the private sector investing more in infrastructure. You've seen that in other parts of the world, Europe and Asia. Public-private partnerships are more common. And to add to what Dan just said and to your question, the state and local governments are stepping up more. We've seen recently the state of Virginia made a big move on transportation after 30 years of doing nothing. Maryland has done something. Even the state of Washington is looking at a 10-cent increase in its gas taxes right now to handle structurally deficient bridges. The state of Wyoming passed a gas tax increase this year. So the states are starting to step up on this.
How about tolls, for instance, Dan McNichol? Is that another solution where it literally comes out of our pockets every time we use the roads or the bridges?
Yeah. You hear politicians on both sides of the aisle say, we need to increase. It has got to come from somewhere. People have drawn a line in the sand about not raising the federal gas taxes. Maybe some states will continue to raise their taxes, but that means tolling. That means private money, that means public money, but it means certainly tolling. I just drove across the United States over the Memorial Day weekend, literally from San Francisco to Boston, and I was only tolled in Chicago, Indiana, and Ohio. That says something. We're really on a free ride that's coming to a quick end, I believe.
As we look at these kinds of accidents or these kinds of episodes, as we saw in Washington State and 5 years ago and 6 years ago, I guess now, in Minnesota, how long do these investigations take and how important are they for deciding what happens next?
They take, I will say, maybe up to 12 months, although the NTSB is very good at educating the public as it goes along. And in the case of the Minnesota Bridge, it led on that it was focusing on the gusset plate and a possible design issue early on in the investigation. And in terms of a replacement bridge, I think the governor of Washington has said he hopes to have something in place by the middle of June. In the case of a temporary replacement bridge, a permanent replacement bridge. In the case of Minnesota, I think it took just a little over a year to do that.
So maybe it won't take as long as it took you to drive across the country, damn it, McNichol?
No, it shouldn't. And that's exactly right. It took 13 months on an accelerated schedule to build the new Minnesota Bridge, and it became a beautiful bridge, an icon. And often engineering is about learning from failures, and this could be another case in point.
Dan McNichol, who wrote The Roads That Build America, and Casey Dinges of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thank you.